All right, so space travel. We're going to break this into several different parts. The first part we're going to talk about is the development and history of rocketry. Now, this is not space. This is not flight. So we need to distinguish between those two things. When they developed rockets, it wasn't so people could ride on them and go to space. They developed rockets for entertainment, primarily at first. And planes and people flying around like birds, that was not in this. That was a completely separate event. Now the two things merged together later, which is great, but those two things are very separate. So let's start with, let's see what you know. First one ever. All right. It was the Chinese who developed this. Fireworks. Fireworks are considered the first combustion-based rocket. Sure, yeah. In World War II, yeah, it was the Germans who really, really got into it and did some great stuff. And the Russians certainly did too. But we're talking like 12th century Chinese, so that's right. So the Chinese developed rockets first few centuries. I mean, we're talking like way back when they first discovered gunpowder, basically. Of course, it burned and all that good stuff, and they'd put different elements in it, and it burned different colors, and they thought that was all great. And they very quickly learned that if they took bamboo shoots, plugged up one end, and jammed the gunpowder in the other, they could actually make these things go into the air. So during religious festivals, other entertainments, I don't know, coronation, new dynasties, I have no idea. But you can think of all the different things that people would think, oh, that's great. Let's show off. Let's make a bright green explosion in the air. So they very quickly figured out that they could launch these things, and that they could launch them under their own power, which was another thing. I mean, you can take a firework and put it on an arrow and shoot it up in the air and then have it blow up in the air, and that was great. But these things didn't have to be propelled by somebody or something. They could propel themselves. And so the first couple centuries of development of these things, and they didn't call them rockets. I don't know what they called them. But the first couple centuries in development of these were just kind of figuring out how it worked. For a long time, they didn't understand, physics. And this is way before 1600s, when Newton and Galileo were actually describing the physics of it. So there's no scientific basis for these things. Chemistry hadn't been developed. It won't be developed for another 1,000 years. But through kind of testing and experimentation, early experimentation, they figured out that these things could happen. The gas itself produced by this could actually propel the thing up in the air. Now, it had absolutely no accuracy. It didn't do a whole lot of damage. They couldn't hit anything with it, so it couldn't do a lot of damage. But in and of itself, these were essentially the first rockets ever created. So the Chinese did this first many, many, many years ago. Basically, every development after that, every enhancement of the rocket came because of wars. Even the Chinese, they originally used these as fireworks during celebrations, but very, very quickly, they started to develop things that would scare their enemies. Again, they really couldn't hit very much, so there's some debate about whether it was actually a useful thing to be shooting at somebody other than, oh man, they're shooting fire at me. That's kind of got to be a scary thing in the 1300s. This is an image of the first gun that they thought, what we would call a gun nowadays. 13th century, so this is 1200 AD. This is 1,000 years ago, more or less. Obviously, the next step in making things is just to make it bigger. So those handheld propellants turned into horse-drawn propellants, which could be carried around in the battlefield. So instead of just putting a little bit of this new gunpowder in there, shove a lot of it in there, and we can make a bigger explosion. And so again, weaponry, conflict, these were the things that we're preparing this for. There's no reason to have a religious festival with this kind of magnitude on it. You know, who are you going to show it to? If you got a little explosion, you can put it up in the air, you can show a lot of people at the same time. There's no need to create something like this unless you're pretending to hurt somebody with it. About 100 years later, what we would call a rocket was first introduced. It was basically a big firework strapped to a stick and then shot. So they used some propellants, some gunpowder as propellants in the back of this thing and some other gunpowder as an explosive in the front of this thing, and they put it on a stick. Any ideas why they put it on a stick? Probably they could stand a little bit far away from it, but he doesn't look all that far away from it. Yeah, to aim it. Basically, the stick provided some stabilization. So there wasn't a whole lot of, flight and rocketry experience here. So I don't know. This is a drawing from a long time ago, but you can see there's no fins on this thing. There's no directionality. If you just try to throw, a stick, the thing's going to just wobble around. So they attached a long pole to this thing and found that they could shoot it more accurately with this stick attached. Again, this is not much more than just enhanced fireworks. It's like you're shooting a bottle rocket at somebody. Yeah, a little bit more explosive than a bottle rocket. You can put a pretty big stick of dynamite on the end of that thing, or what they call dynamite. But these weren't very powerful things. If it hits somebody, you're going to burn them, but you're not going to make them explode or anything like that. These things weren't that impressive. But they were self-propelled. And you can imagine when you're fighting somebody with swords, that if somebody's shooting a rocket at you, even if it really doesn't hurt you, it's pretty intimidating anyway. And again, it's during wars, the Chinese against Mongolia, that is developing these things. 500-600 years, there wasn't much to go on here. No improvements. People maybe made them a little bit more accurate, shoved more gunpowder in there, but there's no chemistry at this point. There's no physics at this point. People didn't know scientific method. They didn't understand. There wasn't, the period of enlightenment hadn't happened yet. So we're talking 500 or 600 years before any other significant developments were made. So in the timeline of things, make the thing, do a little bit better with it, impress your neighbors with it, but then it's, okay, let's just try to make it bigger and bigger and bigger and not improve anything else. Again, we got to differentiate what's going on here. This isn't a thing that somebody's like, oh, I can fly like the birds if I sit on top of this thing. All of these rockets, they were exploding. There wasn't any thought of, I can take this to the next country and go faster. If somebody got on this thing, they were going to go up in the air and then blow up. That's not something that anybody was going for. These things weren't flight ready. They're not going to sit on top of them. All they did in this time period, maybe put another stick on them, made them go a little bit more accurately, put more stuff inside of them. There's just not a whole lot of development that's going on during this time period. So early 0th century, 1st century is discovery of gunpowder. Maybe 5,000 to 6,000 years later, the development of the actual rocket where it goes up in the air and explodes. 100 years later, put a stick on it, make it go more accurate, make them bigger, but nothing impressive. It really took some science in order to get this thing going. One of the major breakthroughs finally happened in the 16th century is the stage rocket. Now this is a model. Can you flip the lights on for me for a second? I'll get it. You got it? So this is a model of the Saturn V rocket. The Saturn V rocket, anybody know what the Saturn V did for us? It did what? Nothing? I'm sure a couple of them did. Yeah, this is the rocket that took us to the moon, the Saturn V rocket. And what the Saturn V rocket did, better than a lot of other rockets prior to it, is it showed off stages of the rockets. So as it turns out, we couldn't do this in just one shot. If you were going to shoot something into space, you need to shoot it really high up in the air, and then shoot it again, and then shoot it again. And the Saturn V rocket, I believe, had 4 different stages of its rocketry. And the Saturn V itself was built into sections, so that sections could separate. So the first stage got it off into low Earth orbit, and that section broke off, fell away, burned up in the atmosphere. Then what was left was something a little bit lighter. Now, if I give this lighter thing another boost, it's going to go faster. So boom, there's another stage going off. And then finally, boom, another stage going off, and what's left over is just this little top part. And that's the thing that actually went to the moon. So this development of stage rockets was very, very, very important in order to get us higher and higher and higher. You've got a single firework, boom, it just goes up in the air. But then if you give it another push, it goes higher. You give it another push, it goes faster. And so the development of the stage rocket really helped us get into space. Without stages, we don't get to space. So every one of today's rockets will use this technology that was developed by Germans in the 16th century. So this is 1500s, 1500s Germany. They developed the stage rockets. And the earliest stage rocket wasn't much more than a boom, a little bit longer, and then another boom. There wasn't a whole lot of control to it. The thing just went really high up in the air. And if you've ever bounced like a tennis ball on top of a basketball, it's the same idea. The basketball gives it a boom, then the tennis ball gives it another boom, and the thing goes way up in the air. Wish I had it. Maybe I do. We can try this. I don't know if it'll work or not, but so bouncy ball, if I just drop it, it's pretty impressive for a bouncy ball. But if I drop it on top of another ball, this is going to hit somebody in the face, I think. Nope. Nope. This is not bouncy ball. I need another bouncy ball. If I have a tennis ball? I don't want to have a tennis ball. We can try this. This could just be embarrassing, but so basically this you can consider the first stage. The first stage in itself doesn't bounce very high. Second stage by itself, it does fairly well. But if you stack them on top of each other and made it go straight up, it would be much better. This is impossible. It's really impressive when it works. Ow. All right, this is evidently not going to work. Oh, there we go. There we go. Nice. It's dark in here. Anyway, so you can see that this thing, when it was launched from the top of that, where it was getting that additional launch, went way higher in the air than it would just by itself, right? And that's the idea behind the multiple stage rocket. You give it a boost, you get it up in the air, then you drop a section off to make the thing lighter, and then you give it another boost, and then it can go way in the air. And we have a short video which shows this process. Right, last takers. Reactors in. Sounds good. War. War and conflict. That was the reason. What do you think? Prior to rockets, what was the best way to drop a bomb on somebody? Fireworks bomb. That's right, like a mixtape. SoundCloud. That's the best way to drop the bombs. Hot air balloons. Yeah, hot air balloons. And you wouldn't believe, these guys, it's Civil War they were using these things. Going real high up to check out everybody. If you can get over your enemy, you can drop stuff on them. And how are you going to get to a hot air balloon? The development of hot air balloons was very, very early in time. So you could actually do that. Of course, that didn't last very long, especially after they developed rocketry, guns, things that could shoot down hot air balloons. But yeah, hot air balloons. And it's because of the control of these things. You can't have a multiple stage rocket that stages once that goes straight up and then once that goes sideways. Half the time they couldn't get these things to go straight up. And this wasn't 20th century that they had these things. They went straight up for like 2 feet and then went straight down and blew up. The development of rockets was incredibly frustrating. The first guys that went into space, I heard this fact the other day, they went on the fifth launch of this particular rocket. What's the rocket called? I forget what the rocket is called. The first guy that went into space went on the fifth launch of this rocket. 2 out of the first 5 of them blew up on the launch pad. The guy had a 40% chance of getting blown up before he even got off the ground. And this was the best technology that we had at the time. You can imagine being strapped to the top of this thing, knowing that when that countdown gets to 0, you're either going to go to space or die. I don't know. That's not a risk that I would be willing to take. Probably why I'm not a pioneer of space travel then. 19th century. So this, again, development of war. You guys know when they created the rifle bullet? During what war they created that thing? Right before the Civil War, they developed this thing. They developed the mini ball. What they did, anybody know how the mini ball works? They shot it through the rifle. So the rifles were pretty long, right? What they did was they spiraled the inside of the rifle. So when the bullet went through, it spun it. Well, that spinning actually keeps the bullet going in the straight line. They use the same technology in rocketry. Now, they developed it over the years, so obviously you can't just sit there and spin somebody if you're going to put it in there. It would just destroy them before they got anywhere. But they found if they spin something that it controlled its flight path a lot more. It stabilized the thing. That led to the development of gyroscopes, other things you could put inside the rocket to control it. Also during the 19th century, 1800s, we're talking about here is the development of chemistry. People actually experimenting in chemistry and figuring out what reactions did what. So they found the combination of different elements, both liquid and solid. They could burn things hotter. And if you can burn things hotter, then you can propel them faster. And if you can propel them that way faster, then your rocket's going to go faster in the end. So it really took some scientific doing in order to get these things going. But in the end, you can make it go as fast and as hot as you want, but if you can't control the thing, it's going to be worthless. You can build a really big bomb, but if you can't make it go where you want it to go, it's a worthless bomb. I mean, maybe you can get something to go into space, but if it's going to go into space and turn around and crash, or go into space and then fly off into nowhere, then it's not very useful for you. So what they needed to do is they needed some kind of breakthrough in physics, really, in order to make these things go where they wanted them to go. Now, 1800s. Does anybody know where we are in flight at this point? Rocketry and flight, two separate things. When were the Wright brothers? 1900 and something. So they had no idea about flight at this point. They couldn't make something go in the air for 10 seconds and not fall down. Wright brothers weren't even alive yet. Carrier pigeons, that's it. Now, these older Greeks had ideas of flying machines. You may have seen these things. I think Galileo had one. Da Vinci had one, that little spiral thing that he drew. Now, these things weren't going anywhere, but they were ideas. Still, 19th century, we had started to develop these rockets, but space flight was nowhere on the horizon. This was 100 years ago, 120 years ago. No idea. No idea how to get off the Earth for more than a few seconds. Was it in the Revolution? 1848? I don't know. It was sometime right before the Civil War. People were very confused during the Civil War because they were like, well, the tactics of war hadn't caught up to the advancement in warfare. You know, people, yeah. I mean, yeah. That was tragic, though, because we probably lost on order of 10 times more people than we would have if we had figured that out sooner. Tragic. Robert Goddard. Anybody heard of this guy? They named something after him? What did they name after him? Rocket Center. Goddard Rocket Center. It's in Alabama. It's in Huntsville. This was an American, one of the few Americans that really did great things in rocketry. He's known as the father of modern rocketry. Everybody around the world used his techniques to develop rockets. Four primary things that he did. The biggest of which was probably liquid fuel rockets. Prior to this, it was gunpowder rockets. It was solid fuel rockets, which actually, ironically, we've gone back to, but way better. Basically gunpowder rockets, but he has developed a liquid rocket, gasoline more or less, that propels a rocket. This allowed a hotter, faster burning flame, which allowed the thing to go higher in the air. His first rocket flight, his first, what they would call a modern day rocket, 15 seconds. Went about 30 meters in the air, 2 stories. And that was this wild success. And this is early 1900s. This is 100 years ago. Best rocket we had 100 years ago, two stories high, 15 seconds in the air. What did it do after that? Crashed into the ground. Happens. After that, gyroscopes. You guys seen a gyroscope before? have? You have it? Got one? Gyroscope? The gyroscope has a heavy spinning wheel in the center. Spin this thing, and it becomes more difficult to rotate. It's a physics principle known as conservation of angular momentum. The faster you spin this thing, the heavier the central wheel is, the more difficult it is to rotate. So you put one of these inside of a rocket. When this thing tilts, it actually corrects itself and corrects the course of the rocket. And there's some videos that are hard to see, but it's really impressive. We'll show them to you in a second. Of a rocket that gets launched, starts going sideways, and then corrects itself, and then goes straight up. It's very, very impressive. That was crucial to having a flight go straight. Gyroscopic flight controls. A payload compartment. The whole thing prior to Goddard was fuel. That's it. There's just a rocket, and the thing was made of fuel, and you shot it up. So it's a piece of metal with gunpowder inside, or now liquid fuels inside. He added the payload compartment on the top, which could take something up in the air and then bring it back. Everything up to this point had come back to Earth in a fiery ball of crash. So he developed parachute recovery. A parachute which would deploy when the rocket started to go down in order to control and safely land the thing. Early 1900s, he's done all these things.